Get started.
Yep,
Oh,
that's
yeah, it's already up. Duh.
no, I just clicked it.
All right. Get started.
Yep, that's
Let's get started, guys. So cool.
I don't know enough Peterson to talk like him, even though I can imitate his voice. Well, actually, Matt, it's like it's sad Kermit the Frog. So it's like, Kermit the Frog. Well, as you actually know,
God, I hate that guy. I know exactly who you're talking about. And man, whew, the only person more insufferable than him, of course, is Steven Pinker. You know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, I got him to block me on Twitter about ever talking to him, so I'm happy.
Nice. Be right
He's
back.
yeah, he's got to mention that his connection to Epstein, and you get blocked within a week. Because he's got a name out. I guess he's got to search for his own name. All right.
I love Pinker because a year ago he was claiming that the pro-Palestinian students at Harvard were promoting anti-Semitism. Then
Mhm.
when Trump attacked, more recently when Trump started attacking Harvard, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and he said, well, there's really very little anti-Semitism at Harvard.
Yep. Yep. That's the heart of pragmatism right there.
Yeah.
The roving opinion on things that are actually not that hard to understand. But
Like there's adaptability and then there's just adapting beyond any foundation.
God, isn't that the truth? Okay, so for our audience, we are going in. We just finished up light, and we're going into bodies of opposition. Um, and then we'll end up on uh what's called the body of individuality before we hit the elements, which is where we'll end tonight. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with all of this, but I'm going to start us off with Kyle, if you could read 279 for us and give us the formal aspect.
Yep. Darkness as immediately the negative of light is the opposition to light's abstractly identical identity. It is the opposition in its own self. It has material reality which falls apart into a duality, namely, one, corporeal difference, i.e., material being for self, rigidity, or two, opposition as such, which, existing independently and uncontrolled by individuality, is merely sunk within itself and is thus a dissolution and neutrality. The former is a lunar and the latter is a commentary body.
Yes, very good. So for those watching, what he is describing here is there are two things going on. Number one is the logical shape of nature that necessitates itself based on the previous forms. Uh, like I said, we just got done talking about light and what it's made up of logically as a category, as well as talking about how natural scientific study maps onto those categories. Okay, and now we are looking at its opposite, darkness. Within the bodies, what he calls the bodies of opposition. Now, this is a logical formation, okay, just like the rest of his system, and uh, and it uses that language. But as you can see at the very end, he maps it onto the scientific observation of the moon and the comets. Now, I'll preface this by saying the science of Hegel's day is what is reflected in the examples here. They some of it has been superseded. A lot of it has, all right, but it does not. Just because it's been superseded, it does not negate the the logical argument with which he started us in nature with space and then time. Okay. So um and we'll talk about that as we go. Um so when he talks here about the various processes that make up what bodies, what natural bodies consist of. Hang on just a second. What, honey? All right. He's going to focus, as here he talks about the body of rigidity having only a formal being for self, and its independence is caught up in the opposition. It is therefore not individuality, but subservient to another body whose satellite it is, and in which it has its access. So here he's talking about. Here he is talking about a particular state of matter. In on this point in the sorry, I'm reaching for words on this point of dialectic at this point.
Spaghetti.
Not right now, honey. Can you ask Gretchen? Can you ask Gretchen to spell spaghetti? SPAGHETTI.
Spaghetti.
Yeah. So as you can see here, this idea of being caught up uh, and subservient to another body describes pretty well already. You can see if we think of bodies in the solar system that are caught up and subservient to another body, we think of the moon caught up in the Earth's rotation and tidally locked, or we think of the cometary bodies, which are caught up in the gravity of the sun and have extremely elliptical orbits. And you can see here, he immediately talks about it. The cometary bodies present themselves as superficial concretion, which in the same chance fashion may again reduce itself to dust. Now, I don't know. I'm not very familiar with the exact science of comets, other than some of the basics. So my knowledge on that's limited. But the way that he portrays the bodies in the solar system and matches it up to the logical shapes, I think it goes a long way toward illustrating much more concretely in the philosophy of nature than in the logic. It's much more accessible because we know about the moons, and we know about cometary bodies. So let's see. The comet appears as a formal process, an unstable mass of vapor. Nothing of a solid nature, such as a nucleus, has been observed in any of them. I think that has been superseded. Kyle, you mentioned it, and I'm going to go finish my coffee. I'll be right back.
Yeah, because we know comets do have, in fact, a nucleus, just mostly made up, even of rock, mostly of like frozen gases and water. And so, of course, throws a lot of that into space around it where it's difficult to actually see the nucleus from, especially of their time. So, I mean, it makes at least makes some sense, especially considering the tail itself is just, pretty much all the sublimation of all the solids into a liquid and gas state. But I'm trying to think, it gets this kind of right that line between rigid and before it gets too close to the sun, and it kind of does become more in its neutral sense as it vaporizes. And I always also think we do have some bodies in the solar system that are made up of smaller bodies, like the belt, both the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt.
Well, remember, and later in here, he says that comets are often transparent, and that counts, at least for the astronomers at the time, as having no solidity. But I mean, ice itself can be seen through, but still be a solid,
Yeah.
still be a solid state, and thus represent a nucleus in and of itself. But I think they were thinking more of the Earth itself, silica, carbon, you know, soil, and so forth. Um, let's see
That's
here.
perfect.
Sorry.
Hmm.
Okay, I read through some of this. It says these two logical sides of the opposition here exist apart. Since the opposition is free, the presence of them both in the solar system is therefore not a chance matter. If we have thoroughly grasped the nature of the notion, it will not seem strange that even such things must be represented as entering within the sphere of the idea, from which alone they derive all their rights. So basically, he's tying he's tying yeah he he's describing the logical shape of the notion. They constitute the subsistent moments of the dissolving Earth. The moon is the Earth's hard interior. The comet is the Earth's atmosphere, which has acquired independent existence, uh, an enduring meteor.
Yeah.
Um, now,
Okay.
uh, I'm going to jump ahead really quick because um, what he's describing is not physical processes or even historical processes, but if you were to interpret it that way, this reads extremely like mystical, you know, that sounds like it would be something out of a sci-fi book. But the fact is that's not the argument that he's making. Um, if I can just go forward because I really want to get this right. Um, he says, okay, he says here near the end, um, he says it in three places towards the end of the section, and I think it's really important to grasp this for the entirety of the philosophy of nature, and if possible, any other work that Hegel, um, has worked on. He says, let's see, he's talking about how the the scientists at the time had started to order the planets based on things like metals, based on things like animals, based on things, uh, you know, and if you go back as far as the Greeks, they were ordered by the gods themselves. Okay. And he says such allusions and analogies are external comparisons which decide nothing. Knowledge is not advanced by their means, only non-philosophical thinking is dazzled by them. Okay. So, and I think that he includes his own parallels and metaphors in this because at the end of the day, the logically derived shapes, whether of consciousness or of thought or of nature, right, as thought categories, right, first of all, are dependent only on themselves. They're self generating. What they're mapped to in terms of philosophy, in terms of historical shapes, like in the phenomenology, or natural shapes, like here, which they're so much easier to map with natural shapes because we have the entirety of scientific learning to map these categories onto. And, there's a reason why they're well mapped onto some of them. Yes, I'm on the class, honey. So play Minecraft, okay? I love you.
Hmm.
So, he goes on to say the arrangement of the planets in space is the act of the planets themselves. They are self-arranging, first of all, right? They're not dependent on a metal or a god or an animal in order to find its place. And he goes on to say, if now a law is sought for this series, as in the case of mathematical series, goes on to quantity, then each term only repeats the same law. But the whole conception of series is unphilosophical and contrary to the notion. This goes back to the logic where he talks about the endless, uh, the spurious infinity, the endless series of numbers that keeps repeating itself like pi, right? And how it always approximates the circle, but never actually approaches the actual circle or the actual sphere, if that makes sense. The whole, yeah, for nature does not dispose its forms on such ladders one after the other, but in masses. Okay, and that last, I'm not sure what he means by masses, but I think he just means material reality. I think he just means material reality or is self-organizing, which is a principle that he continually uh, emphasizes throughout this book. The last thing he says along this lines, he says, um, and I think this is key to everything. The deeper sense of such assertions. Well, first of all, he says, so finally, virgin earth is the simple innocence of this movement, the subject which is the extinction of these moments. By virgin earth was understood earth in its abstract form, i.e., pure silica. If this theory is interpreted in a chemical sense, there are many bodies which contain neither mercury nor sulfur. The deeper sense of such assertions is not that these substances are present, realitaire, but that corporeality has four moments, whatever the chemical makeup it is. Consequently, such elements are not to be regarded as physical existences. Otherwise, Jacob Boehm and others can be charged with absurd ideas and lack of experience, which is true, right? Um, so, what I get from this, on the deeper level, is that the parallels between the well, the parallel arguments that he's trying to make, the one logical and necessary and internal, and what um, what illuminates that from a historical shape or a thought shape or a natural shape. On the other side of it, they're not. One is meant to illuminate the other, but it does not depend on the other. Okay, so like in the logic, he can talk about substance and use it to critique Spinoza. It doesn't mean that his critique of Spinoza is correct. It means that the logical shape of substance, uh, whatever the critique or the shape that he uses, if it turns out to be completely wrong, especially in the philosophy of nature, like with the comet, he says that the comet has no internal nucleus that's solid. Of course, we know that that's untrue. But it being untrue, the logical shape of the category that's meant to be illuminated is still valid. It is still a shape that it's still a moment, I should say, that along with another extreme will create a new middle term in the syllogism, which will drive us to the next point on the spiral, the dialectic. So I'm going to go back to where I was. I was just trying to make that point.
Yeah, and that's kind of like I think there is plenty of neutral bodies out there for us to correspond to as well.
Sure, absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, Kyle, the Kuiper belt or asteroids in general in the system, which conform to the description that he gave the comets, but are more properly thought of as
Yeah.
well.
They got moments of
I'm not
both.
sure.
Think about
I'm
it.
not. I'm not even sure if that's because he talked about the comments as if it was sort of a roving meteorological condition, and an asteroid would fall out of that definition, I think. So,
I guess there's that. Well, there's
and
that one asteroid that was definitely extraterrestrial, but
yeah,
yeah, I guess the point I'm still trying to understand because I was looking like it was my brain was treating it at the very least determinate bodies that are like something wholly physical, rigid, and the other one is indeterminate. That's why he's comparing a comet to the atmosphere, right? Because it's more
yeah, hmm yeah,
loose, gaseous,
yeah,
and
and it dissipates. It has a tail.
yeah.
So, yeah, or
I
at
guess
least we.
I guess what I was thinking is the asteroid belt is kind of an in between. It's definitely a lot of solid stuff in the system, but it's also not one thing you point to. Each asteroid is its own thing. So I guess
Yeah.
it's like a spectrum at that point.
Yeah, I think you're right. So he goes on to talk about um the processes involved with what he identifies with lunar and cometary um, processes. We know that the moon is quite dead and extinct, but he does talk about the process of fire in the moon, which we've since found that it does not have. Um, and
Interesting, because he also said the moon has no atmosphere. So,
yeah,
Of
which
course,
strictly speaking is not true because it does have an atmosphere, but it's very
negligible.
thin.
in fact, it's been
Yeah,
stealing oxygen from the Earth.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, and he goes through a lot of this in here. Um, and he gets to this point, and I love this point because for any of our viewers who have kept up with us with the logic, he actually starts to talk about the syllogism of the sun, the earth, and these bodies of opposition, as he calls them, the moon and the comet. And he says, let's see here, comet and moon thus reproduce in abstract fashion sun and planet. Planets form the middle term of the system, the sun being one of the extremes and the other being formed by the dependent bodies, comet and moon, as the opposition in which the two sides fall apart. And this is universal, joined with the particular to produce the individual, which is the middle term. This, however, is the immediate, merely formal syllogism. It's the starter, right? But it is not the only one. The other, more determinate relation is that where the dependent bodies form the mediating term, the sun, the one extreme, and the earth, the other, which is the individual and the universal being the extreme, and the particular being formed as the middle term. The earth, being itself dependent, is connected with the sun. But the dependent bodies, as the middle term, must contain both moments of the extremes. And since the middle term constitutes their unity, it must be divided within itself, which it is. As we've already seen, moon represents rigidity, the comet as the sort of the atmosphere. Um, each moment must belong to one of the. Not right now, honey. I'm later. Love you. So he says, but sorry. And since the middle term constitutes their unity, it must be divided within itself. I'm reminded of Essence, where division is the primary theme. The two opposites that are joined are still in and of themselves, you know, different from each other. Each moment must belong to one of the extremes. Since the moon belongs to the planet, the comet must belong to the sun. The comet, having no internal fixity, must relate itself to the formal center. Just so, courtiers are closer to the sovereign, who are closer to the sovereign are made less independent by their relation, while ministers and their subordinates display as officials more regularity and hence more uniformity. And he kind of throws this away almost as kind of a throwaway line. But I found it interesting. The third syllogism is that in which the sun itself is the middle term, which is the particular as an extreme is joined with the extreme of the individual, and the universal makes up the middle term. And then he says, this physical relationship of the heavenly bodies taken together with their mechanical relations constitutes cosmic nature. And this cosmic relation is the foundation, the holy universal life in which all living nature participates. And I think this is the definition of the third syllogism, because if you look at the third syllogism, the middle term is the universal. And the universal defines, at this point, joining those two extremes so the particular has been defined, okay, through the first through the second syllogism, right, as to what it is. The individual has been defined by the first syllogism. Okay. So we know what make up the particular and what the individual is made up of. And they're both unified within the whole system, the whole solar system, is what he's trying to say. Planets, comets, moons, anybody in the solar system, including the planets, are all part of one whole totality we call the solar system. That's what the U in the third syllogism um, 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 symbolizes, stands for. You know what I mean? So there's your complete whole that he calls the solar system, is that universal. And after I read this, I really think I understand the syllogism a whole lot better because I can see it solidified in participants in the solar system and what they're made up of at various levels of determination. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I mean, okay, what's individuality first? Let's see. Uh,
Um,
the planet, okay, the planet forms the middle term of the system. So the planet is made up of rigid body, dead body, plus a weather pattern. Okay, there's your planet. The next one is are the comets and the moon. And being the middle term, as he says, they're divided among themselves, and that division is pretty hard and fast, but it is still a particular that unifies them both, even in their difference. And once you have those two, the particular in the and the individual defined quite um, definitively, then you can take these two states of matter, I guess you could say, and unify them within one solar system. So it's really quite an elegant way to put it, and I think it's quite apt. I'll stop talking for a second.
yeah, I think that's where I was trying to get. Just trying to follow this myself. And the first part kind of makes sense because, like, I guess the first part's kind of, I guess, just a solar system tier almost, the formal. The second one does kind of show how. I'm trying to understand that one's kind of like how the moon and comets kind of dependent on its extremes is why it's united together. And the third one, it's like you said, is the big paragraph one. He brings it all together. Plus, it does kind of put the sun at the center of the solar system too.
The thing that stands out to me, especially with this very concrete example of how the syllogism operates, is that most scientists approach the problem of the solar system from the perspective quite immediately of the third syllogism. They look at the solar system as the starting point, right? And then they begin to define the objects in it. What are the easiest ones to identify? Well, the individual level, the planets, right? So you've got your whole, and you start identifying, the eyes, the individuals, the planets one by one. And eventually you start noticing all the moons and the comets, and these are harder to define, I think. So you start to get your particulars, your P's, right? And the problem with starting at the very end scientifically is that you're just sort of bric-a-brac finding things and putting it into your theory and hoping that you've found everything. But just like logical arguments, if you start with the absolute and start to identify particularities, you're not, uh, you're always in danger of something being left out that you haven't been able to see yet. So a good example of this would be if you're looking at the P, the particular, you're looking at moons, you're looking at comets. The definition of moons and comets are harder to pin down, especially when you consider that if you look at our lunar body, it if it's defined as not having an atmosphere, there are many moons in the Jupiter and Saturn systems which have atmospheres ranging from water to volatile gases to, you know, almost nitrogen. Well, I wouldn't say nitrogen oxygen. They're probably a little more wild than that if I recall. But you can see from this that the understanding and which the scientific community um, uses with observation can easily you know
Even
yeah.
classif classifying bodies as a body, a planet, or a moon. That's not cut and dry because we have the case of Pluto.
To this day, we're still redefining what's in this solar system. There's even supposed to be a 10th planet out there that's affecting gravitation that's already made the news within the last year.
Yeah.
And the media like to jump to conclusions, of course, and say, well, this is probably a 10th planet, and so we're going to treat it like that. No matter what the actual papers say, you know what I mean? The scientific papers.
I mean, there's enough evidence at least that it could be there, but yeah, they pretty much make it more concrete too soon.
Yeah. No, it's really true. Uh, and he says at the end of here, it is through our share in this universal life that we sleep and wake, and that we are differently disposed in the morning and the evening, right? And so our share in that the universal, um, our our participation in that universal life, it means that we're affected by not only our own planet, but also, the tides are, you know, come in and go out based on the position of the moon and the sun, um, whatnot, as well as where the planets are. Not going. Yeah, go ahead. So yeah, there you go. Uh, I don't. Okay, so at the very end here, I want to talk about this really quick because I kind of want to get you guys' opinion on this. So he says, um, uh, the weather also makes itself felt in the scars of wounds which have left behind a local weakness. But although recently much has been made of cosmic conditions and relationships, yet for the most part, the subject has remained at the level of empty phrases, vague generalities, or quite isolated influences. The influences of comets should by no means be denied, and I think this is a joke. Okay, because he leaps from saying this is all superstition. But then he makes the joke about how he wrung a groan from Herr Bode by saying that experience shows that comets are followed by good vintage years in wine, as in the years 1811 and 1819, and that this double experience is as good as and even better than that regarding the return of comets. Um, and then he says, what makes comets so good is that the water processes detach itself from the earth and thus brings about an altered state in the planet. This is a joke.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, if you take from these observations that I'm saying that the weather detaches itself as the comets get closer, you've failed and you need to take my class over again, you dummies, right? It
What is
I,
it? I
I don't
once
know. I found it really funny.
I once wrung a groan from. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just not familiar exactly. I'm still not getting the joke, but I know it has to be a joke. 'Cause
Well, well. The
yeah,
joke is that superstition would have it, okay,
right.
that wine vintages are affected by cometary returns, which is, of course, completely
Oh,
ridiculous,
the water
right?
process detaching from the earth. That's the part I wasn't getting.
Well, so previously, um, if you map on the states of that he's already described logically, right? Um, so you have, you have the sun, right? And then you have
The neutral body is what
the
it's.
neutral bodies, right? And then you have the earth. The earth is the unity of the neutral bodies with the with the rigid bodies. So the moon represents the ground, just the ground, and the neutral and the other half of the difference. Remember, this is essence. This is the second term, right? So there are two terms to be dealt with. There's the rigid, and then there's the atmosphere over the rigid. And if you look at the unity of this, the images of the Earth. The Earth is a rigid body with a weather system. And here he's showing in the opposition, the essential
Right.
bodies of opposition, that these two Earth processes are separated. Okay. He symbolically, metaphorically likens them in the solar system as being comets, which is the weather system, and the moon, which is
Yeah.
just the rigid body, the hard matter, right? So, and again, and the third part, which represents the full notion, I guess you could say, is the earth, the self-like point of unity. He says, the opposition which has gone back into itself is the earth, or the planet as such. It is the body of the individual totality where rigidity opens up into a separation into real differences, and this resolution is held together by a self-like point of unity. So he's talking about the earth or any other hard planet, really. Again, it's a metaphor, right? If you look at Jupiter and Saturn, for instance, they're made of gas all the way down to the point of like crushing pressure, right? So that would fall outside of the metaphor if we're going to be technically speaking.
I mean, technically, they also theoretically have a solid center of rock. It's just so deep in there we can't know for sure.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
He does get quite specific on this. The body of individuality, he says, is the Earth, not just any planet.
So the Earth is the
Yeah.
planet as such.
Yeah, as such, that combines those separate previous terms as one point of unity, which is as a rock with a weather pattern. Okay. And that these moments, these logical natural categories are mapped onto natural processes, as you can see. So if you just keep in mind that the shapes of the categorical natural shapes in themselves uh, are are derived from what nature turns out to be in being time, in being space and then time, and then so on and so forth, and eventually disclosing itself to be the entire system of matter and energy, right? Um, that that logical shape takes real natural form, and the point of the philosophy of nature, of course, is to give that to give our representations, I guess you could say, of those natural objects a logical internal logic. Sorry, I said the same word twice. That can be counted on to not leave anything out in terms of their logical shape. So even saying it that way, like I tried to I tried to talk to Doug a little bit about the phenomenology yesterday, and even repeating how Holgate puts it, it's not it's not easy to get that across to someone who hasn't immersed themselves in this for a couple years, and so they get it because they see it. It's like uh it's hard to teach. It's hard to Sorry, I'm digressing like crazy.
I think a lot
Um,
of colleges, when they teach Hegel, they start with the phenomenology. Maybe that's not the best way of doing things.
no, no, yeah, I'm right there with you, Jim. If anything, I would start like we did with the well, with what Harrison recommended we start with, which is what we did with the Encyclopedia Logic, which sort of lays out that it's meant to be a critique of past philosophy, and not only a critique, but also a um, sublation of all that philosophy into a new order, which discloses its internal knitting together through necessity, right? And then you can, yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
I was to say because it's also ontological in the sense that it's a logic of the categories. It's ontological because it's well, starting from the beginning and metaphysical because it's describing how. So it's all doing all that at once because it's describing how being is. So it's all that at once,
Yes.
which makes sense now because you kind of have to. They all start at the same point.
Yeah.
Sorry, it just kind
No,
of
no, no,
thinking
no,
back onto
you're
that.
right.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting about back on that now. It's just they're it's almost dialectic because they're all kind of separate but at the same time interrelated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the name of the game is
I know
interrelation. Yeah.
exactly. Yes.
Now,
Realizing
from one point of view, like I could see giving someone in Hegel's time, like if I handed the phenomenology to Goethe at the time, he's thoroughly schooled in the culture of the Western world, and so for him to open up the phenomenology following right after the Napoleonic conquerings and so on and so forth, and he's familiar with the culture. He's read Sophocles and all of these things. He's going to know what Hegel is trying to do by mapping these logically derived forms of consciousness as they wend their way up to science itself to these cultural forms, right? But for us, you know, it's a little harder to be able to see how the parallels of the logical shapes and the instances they're mapped onto, they don't cross the streams, like in Ghostbusters. Um, it's easier to see it. No, it's not easier to see. I think it's easiest to see here, probably in the philosophy of nature, because we can see natural things, suns, planets, various things that are going to show up in here. And if they're mapped onto a logical category, as happens here, it's much easier to see. But you don't get to that in a system until the second, uh, well, the second book. Which is why, again, for the audience, if you ever study Hegel, don't stop at the logic or the phenomenology. Okay. Go from the logic to the nature to spirit. And then I would argue, go and read the phenomenology, read uh, um, the philosophy of right, which deals with the state and property, and read his um, meditations on history, on philosophy, and religion, because those are all expressions, as he says, of spirit itself. And those expressions, put another way, are sort of conclusions that he makes, but he doesn't just draw them. Um, he how do I want to say this, Kyle, Jim?
hmm,
He structures them like he does everything else in his system, by building up from the abstract to the most concrete shape, and then shows that the concrete shape was the subject of the scientific study all along. So if you look at absolute knowing at the end of the phenomenology, that is the manifest shape of human experiential knowledge in its totality. Okay. And that is what actually exists. And he's trying to show you all of the pieces of the body that are within this totality. And then at the end, tell you they were actually never unconnected from each other
it's
all
coming
along.
from the pure abstract of it to the pure concreteness of it.
Right. 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 He,
Because that's kind of remember that's how mind loops back upon itself in the original logic, is it's pure
yes.
being, but then it's absolute idea at the end, which is still all being, but it's not because it's all pointing back into itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And, um, I, one, I'm pretty sure he says this at one point or another or several places, but not only does the circle point back to being, the circle also points out of itself
Mhm.
into nature and through nature to spirit. And once you get to absolute spirit itself loops back to sheer being
Yeah.
all over again, except sheer being is now populated by that entire run of those three books. And you can look at what being is to be the totality, the end universal, which consists of logic, nature, and spirit all at once, all at the same time. It's one reality. And because it loops back on itself, that's the infinity. That's the true infinity, is that all of reality is made up of these three things, but they're not actually separate from each other. Does that make sense?
I think that's what he says at the end of the logic. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one circle, but it's one circle made up of like three concentric internal circles, I guess you could say, right? Because they all reflect each other. And whenever he's talking about the return from the other, it's with the other that it returns, right? So when you're talking about spirit, it not only is made up of the natural or rigid, it's also made up of the weather pattern or logic, which is what's in our heads, our thought space. So if you think of the cometary cloud and the moon together, metaphorically, you could take those two objects and say it forms the planet, which is what spirit is to us. Humanity is, you know, is the rigid body and the weather pattern. Our material bodies plus our thought space that our brain generates. And there you go. Holy shit. I that was off the cuff, by the way. I'm
It's the thinking matter and the substance.
and the meat space,
I'm trying to think of Spinoza's two split. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. If there's a better detailing of what monism is, you can't get any better than reading Spinoza and Hegel, because Spinoza was the one who was able to bring it all together in his, and Hegel gives it its differentiation to as far as philosophical science could get at the time. So the pinpoint, the detail, the focus became much sharper with Hegel, is what I would argue. Um, Spinoza gave us Spinoza gave us the outlines. It's like it's like at the end of Revenge. It's like the end of Revenge of the Sith. At the very end, you see the Emperor and Darth Vader looking at the Death Star, and it's like very early days where it's just kind of a scaffold of a sphere, right? If you think about that sort of schematic is like what Spinoza gave us, I think. Hegel filled in the rest of it, like obsessively. And so you have the Death Star from New Hope, um, which is made up of. Can you imagine how many people could actually live on that? I saw a meme the other day that basically said everything you saw in A New Hope, from the hangar where the Millennium Falcon set down in the Death Star, to the offices and hallways connecting where they went and then came back to it and left. It was like a dot. And then the rest of it is the giant moon. And I'm like, you could house billions of people, personnel on that Death Star, which I think that was probably I think that was probably their end game. If you can imagine the Death Star filled with billions of people. But at the time it was destroyed, it was probably just a skeleton crew.
The body.
Anyway, sorry.
The back.
I'm going off into
Return to
yeah.
mentioned Goethe before, and Goethe, I'm sure, would have understood Hegel because he was, among other things, an expert on Spinoza.
Yes. Yeah, he of all people would have seen the connection. Um, Hegel for himself was trying to uh, he was trying to appear to be anti-Spinozan in his critique. But if you look at the structure of Hegel's arguments, they were Spinozan through and through. Which I think even his opponents realized uh, from the start. Um, okay, sorry. The body of individuality, the earth. So we've already been through some of what he has to say here.
In the back. And tail. Kitty.
Um, Julian, go ahead and play your Minecraft, okay? We'll go to bed in about 5 minutes, all right? Yes, we'll go to bed in about 5 minutes, all right? I love you. Okay, so it's 8:58. We've actually talked about most of this. Is there anything that I missed in terms of the body of individuality? Because he talks about the planets, he talks about physical constitution and the analogy, and he mainly talks about this idea that so like um he continues with this theme about Kepler being closer to getting it right, whereas Newton got it so bad and sort of pseudo metaphorical. And the fact that Newton is the one that won all the credence and fame, right? Again, it's sort of like Thomas Edison, who took credit for the light bulb, but it was actually,
Yeah.
an electricity, but it was actually people like Franklin or uh,
Tesla.
I hate that Tesla is now a car brand, which is total trash. And he was supposed to be I hate that they stole that name. Okay. Anyway, yeah, and so he comes to this. What does he says? He says the planet is the veritable Prius, the subject in which the differences exist only as ideal moments, where life first has a real existence. So the true mixing of the rigid and the weather pattern, so to speak, the cometary and the lunar. The sun is the servant of the planets, and sun, moon, comets, and stars generally are mere conditions of the earth, which is true. The sun, therefore, has not produced the planet nor thrown it off. On the contrary, the whole solar system exists together as one system, since the sun is as much produced by the other bodies as they are produced by it. His sort of categorical insistence that the sun and the planets as a solar system is one whole system, I think is very apropos and is actually, like, in reality, scientifically proven as the fact, right? It's
Right.
one solar, what do we even call that? Like a nebula that forms into a solar system, right?
Protoplanet disk.
Yeah. It's
That's
it's
correct,
it's
yeah.
it's one rotating disk of energy that eventually coalesces into the star and the planets and all of these other bodies that all interact during the lifetime of that solar system. And his categorical and logical insistence of them being one system is where I think the elegance of a philosophy of nature actually comes to the fore. And he, as you can see here, we haven't gotten to spirit yet, but he likens it to the ego and the spirit and their two, I guess you could say, uh, the relation to each other. Um, um, there's little more to be said here of the individual body, the earth, because what follows is nothing but the explication of this individuality, whose abstract determination we have here reached. So basically, he's saying that's the end of my argument, and then he starts to go down to talk about quality and quantity. Um,
Yeah, that's and then the whole part of the metals
Sort of
was
Yeah.
stuff.
almost kind of reminds me of the was it nodal lines of measure relations in a way.
yeah.
It's just sort of kind of like making a line,
Wow.
connections out of something.
And back and get the glass later.
That was actually more logical determinations. I'm not sure why it makes me think of this exactly
Mhm.
yet. I guess because it's trying to make a gradual connection to something that's not necessarily gradual.
Well, you notice here how when he talks about the earth at this level of abstraction, we can only really talk about it we can't talk about it any more concretely than that of the earth being itself. And so we can define it in terms of quality, quantity, and magnitude. Going past that into the essential or into the notional, at this level of abstraction, he is saying is basically to go into the realm of fantasy. Ordering the planets by metal or by animals is basically trying to fill out the essence or the concepts of what makes up the earth with external relations of things outside it that could give an order, but it doesn't really make any sense. So, he talks about, the metals like Venus bears the sign of copper, Mercury of quicksilver, the earth of iron. None of these things actually map onto them internally logically, right? Like, does Venus actually contain copper? Well, it probably does, but like, is it defined by copper, the metal? It isn't, and it's an external relation which is completely arbitrary and moreover cultural, right? So it's an external cultural, so on and so forth. All he's really saying is at this level of abstraction, the earth, we really only can measure it by quality, quantity, and magnitude. That's it. Once we get better focus on what the earth is and can be talked about more concretely, right? It will show itself to be a combination of inorganic and organic matter, of course, and um, those things are actual internal, internally produced relations. I guess you could say. Um, yeah, the rest of the section is basically saying nothing else but being can be attributed to the earth. That's it. You go into essential, you go into notional. At this point, it's all fantasy, right? And spirit at the early level of science did exactly that, and he lists off, like I was talking about, the metals, the animals, the 24 classes of planets, so on and so forth. Aristotle and the animals. Kepler with the musical scales, right? Um, geographic with the no, not geographic, but mathematical with the Pythagorean school. Um, and he talks about the elements as well. And he says the only really, the only real truth that the elements gave us was that there are four moments um, to corporeality. And if you think about it, um, that's a real abstract. Um, sorry, I'm losing it. the fact that it has four moments, he says there's truth in that, but what those moments are has not been disclosed by the logic of nature, I guess you could say. It's 9:07. If you guys have closing thoughts, those are kind of where I kind of lose steam on this,
No
and
problem.
my voice apparently.
I'm leaving the steam as well. It's just getting late for me too. So
Yeah. All right. So let's read from the Elements 105 to I'm wondering if we can uh
4 elements of opposition.
yeah, yeah,
That makes sense.
visual
right?
element. So why don't we read from 105 to 113? Because then we get through the individual element. And then we can go on the next time to the process of the elements. And that way we're not just sort of like going one at a time, but here kind of putting three into one. It's what is it, 8 pages? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, 8 pages. All right, comrades. If you got nothing else, I'll see you next week. We'll talk about it online if you like, on the DMs.
Yep.
Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.